Okay, greetings to everyone. And Paul, nice to have you with us on this webinar, Zoom session. Okay, so greetings. Good. You, Lorraine, nice to see you, joining in from Cape Town. Okay. Right, first of all, welcome to everyone. And just a little bit of news. I'm informed by the powers that be that this is the last session in this particular series. I think from next Wednesday night they're starting we are starting a different style group. I think it's going to be in front of a live audience in the JLE and Zoomed as well. So I think it's going to be a different format, and I think it'll be based on questions and answers, issues to be discussed. We'll see how that turns out. So thanks to all of you who've been with me through this COVID period Zoom time, and we'll try and wrap it up with a subject tonight that I hope you'll find interesting. I think that Sunday nights the JLE is planning a 5 or 6 part session, and there I hope to do a series starting not this Sunday but the next one on why things happen. Why things happen. Okay, the Ramchal in one of his classic works lists 12 reasons for why things happen in the world, and I think he's being exhaustive. In other words, those are the only reasons. So that's a fascinating subject to work through. When things happen in life, what lies behind them? Why do things happen? Yeah, we'll try and talk about that. I think that may be a subscription type of course, but information will be made available to the JLE. So for the last session in this particular series, let's talk about something that takes us from Sukkot, which is the festival of rejoicing, into the rest of the year. Let's see if we can extract a message that is a life lesson that I hope you'll find interesting and engaging and useful. Greetings, Howard in Toronto. Nice to have you in the group. And to everyone else. Claire, also welcome as well. I do have my chat open, so if you have a question, something I don't explain well or forget to explain, don't hesitate to ask. Joel, nice to see you with us. Please forgive me if I don't greet you in person, if the name goes past me too quickly on the screen. So feel free to type in a question. Don't hesitate. I'll do my best to see it and acknowledge it and answer if I can. Otherwise, don't hesitate to email me if you have a personal question. The question I'd like to talk about is the relationship between free will and happiness. Let me explain what I mean, and stay with me closely, please, because there are layers here, and this is one of the deepest, touches on one of the deepest of all subjects in Torah and life, and I think that you'll find an avenue of access here to the question of happiness and also to depression. I don't mean chemical depression or medical situations of depression. I'm talking about life depression, feeling down. What is the cause and what is the solution to that very, very common problem? So let us begin. I'd like to share with you an insight into one of the great Spanish commentaries of the 14th century, Rabbi Crescas, quite remarkable, an outstanding individual among a generation of towering giants, not long after the Rambam, similar generation to the Rashbo in Barcelona, one of the giants of Spanish Jewry. Rav Chazdai Crescas was born in 1340, if I'm not mistaken. His son was killed by the Spanish. He lived through the difficult early Inquisition times. You probably know that in 1390 or 1391 Jews were expelled from there. 1492 they were expelled en masse again. Very difficult times, and yet those generations, those centuries produced some of the greatest works of that era. And he wrote a monumental work called the Or Hashem. It is a philosophical and halachic work. He wrote it to rival, in one sense, the Rambam, his major work, although it never became accepted in the way that the Rambam's did. But it's a monumental work from that era. And he has some outstanding opinions on a number of issues. And I'd like to talk about one of them. And see if we can think it through. He talks about free will. We'll get to happiness and how it applies. But he has a remarkable opinion, what we call a shitta, a remarkable shitta, about one particular aspect of free will, and I'd like to try to explain it. Again, let's remember this is not everyone agrees. I would say he's quite an extreme opinion. And although most others don't agree, nevertheless you'll see the element of truth that everyone does agree to here, and I think despite his being an outlying opinion, I think you'll find a universal message. In his work Or Hashem, in a couple of places, and in a more recently discovered and published work called the Droshas HaPesach, which is an amazing and outstanding work and much more accessible, much more readable, much less philosophically dense, he makes the same point. And let me tell you what it is. Remember the context that he's talking about? Yes, if someone raises a hand, I see someone's raised a hand. Nathaniel, don't raise a hand, just type in your question, okay? Don't raise a hand and ask for permission, just type your question in the chat box and I'll do my best to note it. The subject, the context he's talking about is Simchas Yom Tov, the joy of a festival. The particular context he's talking about is Pesach. But I think you'll see that the Pesach continuum, which leads to Shavuot, the receiving of the Torah, ultimately to coming to rest in the Sukkah, I think you'll see that it's a continuum, and this same idea applies to all of them. And in one way, more particularly, when it comes to Sukkot, which we've just lived through, and I'll try to explain what I mean. And in the context of discussing, or leading to a discussion, on the subject of happiness, and particularly the happiness of a festival, the joy of a Yom Tov, Simchas Yom Tov, which is a mitzvah, right, a mitzvah, Samachta b'chagecha, the Torah actually posits that obligation when it comes to Sukkot, to being in the Sukkah, needs thought. What is the particular rejoicing of sitting in a Sukkah? Why joy? Another question one might ask here is, why is Shabbat not a time of Simcha? Or, more specifically, the central mitzvah of Shabbat is not joy. We do say Yismuchu b'cha, right? Kol Mekadshe Shabbos. We do talk about Simcha on Shabbos, but the central work of Shabbos is what we call Menucha. Menucha means rest, or Oneg, which is a certain type of a pleasure, but not Simcha as such. And yet the work of a festival is very much Simcha, and not rest in that sense. There's an overlap, of course. Shabbat has something of the festival in it, and every festival obviously has something of Shabbos in it, but they're two very different types of headspace, and that is food for thought. So let's focus on the headspace, if you like, or the spiritual work, the mindset of a festival, which is joy, and try to plumb the depths of what that means. And here's what he says. He's talking about free will. Free will. His radical opinion is that we have very little free will. Very little free will. For many reasons. The classic context in which he raises this is the question of God's foreknowledge, right? That's called Yediyah, the problem of Yediyah and Bechira. Old philosophical and religious problem. If God knows in advance what you are going to do, how can you possibly have any free will? We've discussed this on previous occasions, and you're welcome to look up the recording of that discussion. If Hashem knows in advance what you are going to choose, there really is no other option. And if there's no other option, you do not really have free choice. So it would seem. But that is a well-known subject, and of course that's a full subject to discuss on another occasion. But in the course of that conversation, that discussion, he makes it clear that we have very little free will from other perspectives as well. Let me try to express this as broadly as I can. He feels that there's a causal web of phenomena in the world which lead to our decisions. In other words, a lot of what you do, to put it quite bluntly, you don't really choose. And even very idealistic actions, and even very spiritual and religious actions, can be done out of habit with very little choice. Now, the focus of being a human being, certainly of being a Jew, but a human being in general, is to use free will. What marks you off as distinct from the rest of the world, from the astronomical world, from the spiritual world, spiritual beings, from the material and the animal world, is that you have free will. And free will is a divine capacity, the ability to choose, and the ability to choose from nothing, right? To originate something. No other part of the world, no animal ever originates something. Everything an animal does is a cause-effect feedback loop. Everything a molecule does, a chemical does, any part of the universe is acting in line with its physical causes, cause and effect. Only a human being can break that. Only a human being can originate something truly new, and that's a divine capacity. But in the course of this discussion, Rabbi Crescas makes the point that although you're capable of making free will decisions and originating things from your capacity of will, many things, and perhaps even most things you do, are not really chosen. Let's face it, most of the things we do out of habit. Right? We do them out of habit. Let's think about some of them, our most religious actions. Are you really choosing them actively every day? When you make a bracha before you eat, you put on your tefillin. Right, or what? Are you really choosing that? And further, are you grappling against alternatives? Most of what we do, even in meaningful relationships, even in a marriage, most of what we do is really habit patterns. We do it because we've done it before. And therefore, to claim free will, to claim reward for those actions, right, to take responsibility for those actions, very difficult. I would say, he doesn't put it in these terms, but I think, as Rosh Shapiro explained to us, I think what he means is something like this. Imagine an addict. Imagine a person is addicted where there's no free will left at all. Imagine a person addicted to the point where they cannot refuse their next episode of drug use. Do they have free will? Well, at that point they may not. There may have been a point of freedom a long time ago. Perhaps some ill-considered decision as a teenager where they got into drugs led to many years of a pattern, or a smoker perhaps, or you could take any other lifestyle issue. It could be that this person's eating habits, their smoking habits, their drug habits, it could be very, very well be that a person might have reached beyond a point of freedom. I'm not claiming that every addiction is beyond the point of freedom, but I'm asking you to consider one that is. Where's the freedom in that action? The freedom might have been a point of choice a long time ago that chose a course, and that course of action has led far down the road to a situation where there may be very little choice. Is there accountability? Well, there's accountability for the point of origin and the changes that could possibly have been made somewhere along the way. But it's quite conceivable that you're in a situation now with very little choice. Howard, indeed, this relates very much to Rav Dessler's Bechira point, and this could be indeed below that point, or above the point, however you want to put it, where a person's point of free will does not extend into this particular behavior. So that's one application of Rav Crescas' idea about how little free choice we have. So, again, the context and the background, his approach is that our free will is much more limited than many others would admit. But let me share with you his most extreme view. He says, now this is very surprising, he says when it comes to matters of faith, there's no free will at all and there's no possibility of free will. Now let's work on this because this is a very challenging idea. In fact, he goes so far as to say that the basis of the whole Torah, which is the first of the 10 Commandments, I am God, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, he says it's not even a mitzvah. There's no free choice in it, you couldn't choose it if you tried, and therefore there's no way it could be given as a commandment. Let's discuss this, it's an amazing thing, let's go through this. First of all, let me give you the context, because he's not the only one to say something along these lines. In a famous discussion between the Rambam and the Ramban, and others of that great era, there is a famous discussion about whether the first of the 10, let's call it commandments, is indeed a commandment. According to one opinion, of course it's a commandment. Certainly it's the first of the 10 commandments. First of all, the positive commandments in the Torah, the first mitzvah, I am God. That is the foundation and origin of all the other commandments, and it is not only a commandment, it is the major origin of all commandments, and it certainly counts as a commandment. But there are those who feel, and Rav Crescas fits very, very clearly into this camp, that the commandment, the first of the 10 commandments, and you know in Hebrew they're not called commandments, they're called dibros, let's call them statements or sayings, is not a commandment. It's not a mitzvah. Now, let's not for a moment think we're downgrading it. We're not downgrading it to a status less than a mitzvah. On the contrary, we're upgrading it to something greater than a mitzvah. It is the concept that underlies all mitzvahs, but yet it's not a mitzvah itself. First of all, the evidence for that, the evidence is always in Torah, always textual. things stand or fall in Torah always on the text. And look at the text. The first of the 10 Commandments is not phrased as a commandment. It's phrased as I am. The rest of the commandments are phrased as you shall or you shall not. Clearly expressions of commandment. But this one does not say that. I am the Lord your God. I am God who took you out of Egypt. Not you shall, and certainly not you shall believe in me. Which means that the Torah is not phrasing it as a commandment. That's very interesting. And therefore, says Rabbi Crescas and many others who follow his line of thinking, you see the Torah is not phrasing it as a commandment. It's not a commandment, it's simply a statement of fact. Let's put it another way. If a series of commands are issued, before the commands are meaningful, there has to be a commander. Unless you accept the authority of the one who's giving the commands are meaningless. So, you don't have a commandment to believe that there's a commander. Right? If I give you a string of instructions, that the first thing that is taken for granted is that I have the authority and validity to give you those instructions. I don't start by saying, here's your first instruction, I am the instructor. Doesn't make any sense. And therefore this is the ground on which all commandments stand. Unless there's a commander who is valid and authoritative, you cannot begin commandments. And therefore says Rabbi Crescas, I am God is not a commandment, it's simply a statement of fact on which all commandments stand. I think you can see the logic of that. Of course, if he holds it's not a commandment, he'll have to count the 10 commandments slightly differently. Or he'll have to count the 613 commandments slightly differently, right? If he wants to get to a total of 10, or certainly a total of 613, which everyone agrees to, he'll have to have a slightly different way of counting them if he's not counting the first one as a command. And of course, everyone agrees that it is an obligation. In other words, you are certainly required to relate to the statement that God is God and accept him as an authority. But it's not a formal commandment. Now then, I think you can see the sense of that discussion. And our great authorities of the 11th, 12th centuries, right, and beyond, have come down on both sides of that discussion. But here's where Rabbi Crescas says something even more extreme. He says it's not possible to have a commandment like belief. It's not possible at all. Now, let me try to explain what he's saying. How do you believe things? What leads you to believe in something? The answer is the way you see them. Right? What leads you to believe that this is white? Well, your eyes see it as white, you register as white, you come to understand that. And that's how you form your opinion. And then, of course, you believe it. You believe what you understand. Right? If you believe the facts to be a certain way, you believe that this is white and this is grey, for example, right? If you believe that, if you see that and you register that fact, then of course you believe it. Here's the point. There's no sense giving a commandment to believe something when you already believe it because you register the facts that way. And conversely, if you don't register the facts that way, no commandment will help. Let me illustrate what I mean. What color is this? Okay, type me please on the screen. Commit yourself. What color is this sleeve? Please type on the screen. I want to see. It's white. Okay. Now, let me say to you, could you kindly believe that it's white? That's meaningless. As soon as you register that it's white, right? As soon as you register that it's white, your senses or your intellect or your judgment tells you that the case is a certain way. There's no sense in asking you to believe it. You already believe it. In other words, you believe things to be the way you understand them to be. There's no added stage called belief. Okay? If you believe that, the sun is shining, or you think the sun is shining, you register the fact that the sun is shining, I can't say to you, could you also believe it? You automatically believe it. And to make matters worse, take this sleeve. Could you please make a strong effort to believe that it's black? I'd like you to try it, please. Could you please believe that this is black? There's no way you can do that. Which means this. If you think that God exists, let's come down to the brass tacks. If you think that God exists, you register the facts that way. You've studied Torah, you've studied Jewish history, whatever the evidence is that you use, and you come to the conclusion that God exists. There's no way I can command you to believe it. You already believe it. There's no point giving you a commandment if you come to that conclusion. There's no point urging you to believe if you already believe, because you think it is that way. And more disturbing is this. If you come to the considered conclusion that God does not exist, you examine the evidence and Jewish history, you think it's all a hoax. You come to the conclusion that God does not exist. No commandment could be possible. You could not will yourself to believe it because you try to. You can't make yourself believe something because you try. Right? No more than you can believe that this is black, no matter how hard you try. And therefore, here's the bottom line. There's no point in giving a commandment about belief. If you already think the thing is a certain way, you automatically believe it anyway. You don't need a commandment. And if you don't think it's that way, no commandment will help. Because you cannot bend your mind into a pretzel. You can't bend your mind into a distortion, right? And come to believe something you don't actually believe. Am I being clear at this point? Please give me a yes. If we are together on this problem, please give me a yes. Okay, great. And therefore, says Rabbi Crescas, there's no point in giving a commandment for belief, right? And then let's take it even one step further, and I'll show you, Jody. What about things you can't see? What about things you can't see? Well, let's follow that. Let's follow that theme. Let's say you can't see something, but you come to the conclusion that the evidence is adequate. Let's say you cannot see electricity, but you come to the conclusion that it's real. You have circumstantial evidence that it's real, then you believe it. And if you figure the circumstantial evidence is not good enough, then you don't believe it, and no commandment to believe is going to help. So, Jody, I don't think that works. If you mean where the evidence is dubious, right, and you have to choose to follow the evidence with not enough evidence, I would say that's not a solid conclusion at all. I'm not sure that emunah, that faith, is really meaningful in that context. But anyway, there's a lot to talk about here, but this is what Crescas says. But Paul, you're saying this. There can be balances of probabilities in your mind. Let me suggest to you that the way you solve the problem of the balance of probabilities is by weighing the balance of probabilities, not by an effort to believe. Okay? Now. Arlene, what's the difference in thinking and believing? Okay, I'm prepared to accept there's a difference between them. So let's say you think this is white. Okay, that's not believing. You think it's white. But then the point is you automatically go on to believe it. You automatically, once you think a thing is a certain way, right? You think it's daytime and the sun is shining. Then automatically you go beyond that to believe. They're virtually the same thing. Or the one certainly entails the other immediately. Okay, now stay with me. Let's go one step further. Let's take the most extreme example. Let's talk about belief in God for people who met God. Now, let's take that. Let's take the Jews who left Egypt. Okay? They left Egypt and witnessed God directly. They saw the miracles. Let's remember that even the Egyptians got the message, and they were not trying. Okay? The Egyptians were trying very hard to deny it, and they were forced to admit and accept. Which means that the Jews who left Egypt got the evidence, saw the evidence firsthand, and furthermore, they met God personally. Now, it doesn't get better than that. Right? When I ask you to please believe that I'm talking to you, that's ridiculous. That's meaningless. Right? I'm seeing lots of people on my screen saying so-and-so has raised a hand. I don't really know what that means. Just give me a second. Maybe if I click on it, it will help me. No, okay. Listen, if you want to say something, just go ahead and type the question on the screen, okay? When it says raised a hand, I'm not sure what I can do about that. So if you want to ask a question, just type it in. Paul, I don't agree with you. You're telling me that if you come to the conclusion that you were wrong, it's electric light, and it's not daytime. So then you change your belief depending on new evidence. I don't care how many times you change. As soon as you have the evidence, Paul, here's the point, stay with me. There's a very simple philosophical point. As soon as you have the evidence entails a belief. As soon as you have the evidence, as soon as the evidence suggests strongly enough to you that certain thing is the case, then automatically, by definition, you believe it. Right? What you think is what you believe. In the conventional use of the word belief. There are other ways to translate emunah, which is a subject for another time. But stay with me. I want to take this to its logical conclusion. Okay? Otherwise, we're never going to get to the subject of happiness. And then we won't be happy at all. So, let's do this. He says, imagine people who have direct experience. Not evidence, direct experience. They left Egypt with direct experience of God. Okay? Now, there's no sense giving them a commandment to believe. And those people are given the same Torah. They have the same commandments as we do. So imagine the Jews in the desert. They've just stood at Sinai. God gives them the Torah. They open it up, and the first statement in the Torah is, I am God. How on earth can you read that as a commandment to believe? They just spoke to him face to face. And therefore, says Rabbi Crescas, there's no sense in which you could give them a commandment. We have a weaker case. Perhaps we have more effort to make to come to think a certain way, as many of you are suggesting, but not for somebody who has direct evidence. So while it may be debatable about what the meaning of belief is for you and for me, there's no debate about it when it comes to those people who experienced it directly. So the bottom line is this, says Rabbi Crescas. When the Jews who left Egypt were given a commandment to believe in God, there's no way it could have been a commandment. It could simply be a statement, and you have to relate to the statement in a certain way. But to say, look, you're speaking to me, could you please believe you're speaking to me? Right? Doesn't make any sense. Now, he says, if you put yourself into the position of those people, or you go forward in history with the evidence and our national experience of Torah, Selen, you are defining faith in a certain way. You're defining emunah as something that's not fully known. I don't want to go there. There's reason to discuss that, and I think there's a place for that, but it's not what he's saying. Okay, so stay with me carefully. I'm giving you the example now of somebody who comes to think something is conclusively true. Says Crescas, you're a Jew, and you've examined the facts, you've studied Torah deeply, and you've come to the conclusion that it's true. Where does your free will apply? Stay with me carefully, please. Your free will does not apply in coming to believe that it's the case. You already believe that it's the case. Chaim, I'm not sure what you mean, but again, stay with me, please. I hope you'll get this point and enjoy it. There's a lot to talk about philosophically, but I want to get to the next point. And the next point is this. You've come to the conclusion that it's true, and now automatically you believe it. No free will. You cannot choose to believe it. But, and here comes the crunch, you can choose your attitude to what you believe. Let me try to explain this. It's a fascinating point. And it's a major, here comes the life lesson. Up to now what we said is philosophical. Now comes the practical. You can choose your attitude to what you think. Let's put it this way. You can choose your attitude to what you believe. You can choose to be happy about it and enjoy it and rejoice in it. You can choose to be resentful and wish it were not the case. Let's work through this. You come to the conclusion that Judaism is true. What attitude do you choose? This is amazing. I'm privileged to be part of that segment of humanity that received the Torah and be the channel to bring it down to the rest of humanity. That I've been given that incredible, unique and special run. Of course, you could be any nation or national group. You could rejoice in the unique role that you were given. But let's take ours. You feel the incredible privilege of being the people to whom Torah speaks most directly, and you think that is most amazing and you can't breathe with ecstasy? Or do you choose to say, I'd rather be eating cheeseburgers? That you can choose. Listen carefully, he's saying something amazingly penetrating, psychologically. When you think the facts are a certain way, the facts force themselves on you a certain way. You see a certain relationship that you have in a certain way. Your marriage, some relationship in your family. You see your own personal situation a certain way. You read the facts a certain way. You see your privileges or your limitations. You have no choice about seeing them that way because the facts, you've read the facts accurately. But what the psychologists call, are you well adjusted or are you badly adjusted? Do you choose an attitude, which is this is amazing, and I choose to focus on the advantages, and I choose to focus on the opportunities? I choose to focus on how to make this relationship incredible? Or do I choose to look at it resentfully and with a depressing eye and wish it were not the case? Let's take the example of your Jewish identity. Do you rejoice in it and own it and buy it and feel ecstatic about it? Or do you to resentfully, wishing it were not the case, repudiating it, rejecting it, and admitting it resentfully only because you're forced to? That is your choice. And let me tell you what he says about Simchas Yom Tov. He says the joy of a festival is feeling the privilege of this unique identity. If you know what Pesach is, talking about Pesach, but of course we can transplant that into Sukkot as well. If you understand what this means, that I have a history going back to those Jews who left Egypt, where God appeared to us directly, and we became the fulcrum of Jewish history, and we have the role of relating to Torah and to Him in that particular and unique way, and they've been marching through history towards a cosmic destiny that has been going for 4,000 years with most of the world trying to kill us, and we're still doing this. Rav Moshe Shapiro used to say, when you know what it means to be Jewish, you should be dancing in the street like a drunk Cossack. That's what he used to say. It should make you drunk with ecstasy. Or do you say to yourself, this is a drag, and all this means is persecution and difficulty and obligations and a relationship with God that I wish were not true? That's up to you. Amazing. So Crescas says this: your free will is in your choice of attitude, and you can choose an attitude of rejoicing. And what you're rewarded for when it comes to your faith is your happiness. When it comes to your faith, the choice you make and the reward, the spiritual growth that you experience, is in your choice of attitude. It's your positive attitude and the way you choose to rejoice in it. Your alternative is to be resentful. Either way, you believe the facts to be the same. The facts are the certain way, right? This is white, and you rejoice in the fact that you have this garment to wear. Or you look at it resentfully, you wish it were multicolored and some other color. The facts force themselves on you. You read it as white. That you have no choice about. But how do you feel about wearing a white garment? That's up to you. This is an amazing point. This is an amazing point. And for those people who are going through therapy, psychotherapy, psychological difficulties, or people involved in administering therapy, helping people, first of all, it's a major tool in therapy to see that you have free will. Many people in many different life circumstances, their psychological problem is they feel like a victim. They're caught in the grip of a psychological problem, or they feel they're caught in the grip of an external problem, not in their heads, the problem of a certain dysfunctional relationship, right? And they're resentful about it, and they feel they're imprisoned and locked in. The first thing to realize in any therapy, or any step on the spiritual path, is that you have free will. Absolutely, you can make a difference, and that's why you're here. Now, if there's such a person turns around and says, but I have no free will, because this relationship is somebody I cannot choose, they're related to me, I'm locked into this relationship, I'm imprisoned in the relationship, I have no free will. That may be true. That may indeed be true. It may not be true. But it may be true. But even if it's true, are you locked into your attitude? Do you have to choose your attitude? And I don't have to tell you that there have been people walking into gas chambers, or people tortured in concentration camps who chose happiness, and people at the top of the world, with wealth and privilege and anything any human could ask for in the material world, who kill themselves in misery. That choice you can make. I'm not talking about people who have no free will. Again, there's psychological states beyond free will. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about where you have the freedom to operate, and many people in psychological distress choose to focus on the things they cannot change, on the aspects of the situation they cannot change, instead of identifying where the element of free will operates and choosing that. Okay? I hope this point is clear. It's an incredible message. Now it takes time to cultivate, of course. If you're a person given to pessimism and to see things negatively, it's not so easy to wake up tomorrow morning and suddenly start seeing things positively. But the first step is acknowledging that you have the will. You have the free will to make that decision. That you can do. Here's a story I like to tell to illustrate how people can choose to see things. Okay, in radically opposite fashion. There's a story about a shoe company. Oh, we're going back to the pre-colonial era. It was a European shoe company. And they wanted to expand their market. So they sent two of their salesmen into a tribal environment in Africa that had not been visited by European people ever. Okay, they went into a local tribal African culture. They knew there's millions of people out there in the continent. What an opportunity to expand our market. So they sent their two salesmen into this new land, okay, into a tribal culture, millions of people in the so-called primitive tribal culture, and go out there and sell shoes for us. See what we can do. One wrote back a letter on the day of his arrival in the most tragically depressing terms. He said, "You sent me to a country where no one wears shoes. No one wears shoes. We're not going to sell a single pair. Useless." The other fellow wrote back a letter and he said, "No one wears shoes here yet." What an opportunity! Okay, that shows you how you can choose, right, to see situations. Not choose to see them factually. Right? You have no choice about that. Or at least you should not have choice about that. You should be seeing factual situations as there are. You should exclude your free will. The only choice you need to make there is to see things objectively. And whatever tools you need to gather in order to see them objectively. But once you register the facts objectively, how do you choose to relate to them? Do you rejoice in them, see the positivity, or you decide to get depressed and resentful about them? That is up to you. This is a stupendous point that he's making. And apart from its religious application, in terms of emunah, it is an incredible life lesson. But let's not forget he's talking about emunah, and his point is that when you come to the conclusion that this object of Jewish belief and Jewish story is true, your choice is how do you relate to it. And the spiritual work you do in the world is your choice of your choice of attitude. Okay, now this has immense consequences. I don't have to remind you, it has cultural consequences. The Lithuanian Jewish tradition chooses to see Judaism and Torah one way. The Hasidic tradition chooses to see it differently. It's a different mood. They both might be ecstatic in their own way. But which aspects do you see? What part of your soul responds to the spiritual path? Right? And you can see that. And it's communal and cultural as well. Right? Certain groups of Hasidim, you see, they see the world in a certain way, and it's ingrained in the culture. Right? And there's certain, every aspect, every group of Torah loyal Jews who relates to Torah, the Sephardim, and different types of Sephardim, and Yemenite Jews, Chabad Hasidim, other types of Hasidim, the cold northern climes of Lithuanian deep Torah penetrating analysis, their cultural and psychological and spiritual soul root elements that lead you into the way that you see things, or at least give you those opportunities, but you have the free will to choose how you identify with them. Okay, let's take the next step. I hope you've benefited from this, and I hope you'll find it a very useful and important life lesson. Let's take the next step. Why a festival? Why a festival? What's unique about a festival in terms of its joy? Right? Why does he place this? Right? Why is the festival the time to do this? You can be happy about your role in serving God at any time. What's unique about a Yom Tov? And why not Shabbos? Why not Shabbos? Let's talk briefly, and again, I think we've discussed this in previous contexts, but let's talk briefly about the subject of happiness itself. Let's talk about the subject of happiness itself. What is the cause of happiness? Again, we don't have time to go into a full analysis of this, but let's at least look at one or two basic aspects. Happiness, you probably know, is not a formal commandment. The Torah doesn't say, thou shalt be happy. That's very interesting, by the way. There's no formal commandment to be happy, and yet the Torah makes it clear that it's an obligation. Ivdu Hashem b'simcha. Serve God with joy. In fact, this was one of the elements that made up the Hasidic tradition in the early years. Right? It was a rhapsodic, ecstatic method, right, of serving God in the context of a very depressing and poverty-stricken environment in southeastern Europe. But be that as it may, it is an obligation. Not only that, the Torah has some quite extreme statements about joy. For example, when the Torah goes through 98 curses that the Jewish people will experience, and I'm talking about horrific Holocaust-type curses that the Jewish people will experience through history when we defect from our loyalty to Torah. After the Torah goes through those predictions and warnings, dire in the extreme, it then gives a reason which purports to be the reason for that sort of suffering, which is beyond belief. Because you did not serve God with joy. Because you did not serve God with joy. Is that the reason? The reason we were tortured in the most heinous, extreme forms through history is because we weren't happy enough? Is that possible? What does that mean? Now let's analyze this subject. It's quite remarkable. In the world around us, there is a concept that happiness is a goal to be striven to strive for. I think in the secular culture, the pop culture, the secular culture around us, happiness is a goal. They even enshrine it in their Bill of Rights and their constitutions, the right to happiness, or the right to seek the means to happiness. But in Judaism, happiness is not a commandment as a goal. It's an obligation. We have to understand what that means. But it's an obligation without being a mitzvah. That's an interesting category. That needs analysis. We'll try to understand what that means. How does the non-Jewish world When I say non-Jewish, I mean the culture around us, particularly Western culture. How does Western culture achieve joy in a world fraught with danger and unpredictable tragedy and sadness? How do they achieve joy? The answer is by detachment. One or other form of drunkenness, chemical, or some other detaching experience. It's my personal belief that a lot of the world of entertainment is designed to produce this effect. Entertainment, you can put yourself into a situation of some entertainment situation. Michal, that's correct. Yes, indeed. It's your choice of attitude after you've come to logical conclusions. They say this: in the culture around us, people want to have a good time. They put themselves into some situation of entertainment where they can take themselves out of their reality, escape their reality. Here's one of the real ironies. When they want to have a really good time, they go and watch a horror movie. And though you can have a really good time, enjoy yourself horrible, as they say. You can go and watch people being... I have not been to see a movie for decades. 40 years, I think I haven't been to see a movie. But I see them all the time, because I travel. When I'm sitting on a plane, it used to be there was one screen in front that you had to avoid. Now there's 15 of them all around you, and each one's worse than the next. I see what people are watching. They're watching people being shredded and killed and devastated and demolished and cities wiped out and countries and continents destroyed and planets exploded, and they're sitting there eating their pretzels, having a wonderful time. Now, what is going on? Young man wants to impress his date. So he takes her to a horror movie where she can watch people being killed and tortured. What is that? What is that? But I think if it takes you out of your reality, it's therapeutic, and people want that. But Judaism is a process of superconscious awareness. It's not a process of detachment. Are you allowed to detach on occasion? Yes. And you may need to take a break, and that may be healthy. But our path is not a path of detachment. Ours is a path of joy and ecstasy in the suffering. And we need to understand how that works. So how do you do that? How do you maintain awareness of the suffering and experience a genuine joy? How do you raise children in a world fraught with danger? And at a moment's notice, things could turn upside down. A tragedy strikes at any. How can you do that in a world that has mourning within it? How do you raise happy children? How do you do that? By detachment and forgetting the sadness of the world? No. So how do you do that? Well, you'll tell me you go out with some friends and have something to drink and something to eat and forget about the suffering all around you. Isn't that insensitive? Well, maybe you'll tell me that you'll go out and have something to eat and drink while remembering all the suffering as well at the same time. That's even more insensitive. How do you do this? There's a letter of the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish was the great rabbinic leader, died in 1954. In one of his letters to someone who wrote to him with some personal difficulties, he makes a statement that is, I think, impossible to understand, or apparently impossible to understand. A sentence that he writes is this. He says, makir es oyer ha'oyer shalaemes, for somebody who understands what the light of the lights of truth, very rich language that he uses, but let's put it into simple colloquial English. For anyone who knows what's going on in the world, ein etzev ba'olam. There's no sadness in the world. Now, how can a person say that? There's no sadness in the world? The Chazon Ish lived through his own tragedies. He lived through European destruction. He had the weight of the suffering of the Jewish people on his shoulders. He and his wife were childless. How can a person say there's no suffering? Our rabbis are not given to vague emotional exaggerations. What do you mean there's no sadness in the world? How can a person say that? What about the mitzvah of mourning? Sitting on the floor with your clothes torn, weeping for someone who has died. Okay, it's halachically debatable if you have to cry or not. Maybe you don't have to cry. But the mitzvah of mourning is a mitzvah? What do you mean there's no sadness in the world? What is the man saying? Let's examine this subject, at least as it applies to our particular application. In Jewish thinking, suffering, joy, is not a detachment. Joy is the experience of doing what you must be doing. When you're moving correctly towards a correct destination, you will feel joy. When you're building something important and you see it taking shape, you will feel joy. If you've ever, it's very hard to put this into words, but if you ever struggled mightily to achieve a certain result, Whether it was something you studied for an exam, or some professional project, or some aesthetic project, and you spent hours and hours or days or weeks on it, and you became so addicted to the project you forgot to eat and sleep. Wasn't that ecstatic? Even though your face might have shown only strain and pain, but the inner satisfaction of moving towards a goal and seeing it taking shape is the deepest pleasure, the deepest life pleasure you can experience, far greater than a simple frivolous detachment which always leaves you feeling down when you come back to reality, when you detach chemically and then come back to your senses. There's a place for it, by the way. The Torah says that wine was created for mourners. Wine was created for mourners. There's a place for that. But that's not what we call life happiness, joy. Simcha is the expansion of consciousness into a new reality. As you move into a new reality, you know the word simcha in Hebrew has the same letters as the word chamisha. Very interesting. The word chamisha means 5. And according to Kabbalah, 5 is the number where joy begins. The Maharal puts it like this. He says that 4, this is a principle that the Maharal relates to very often. 4 is the basic world, the 4 corners of the earth, north, south, east and west, the 4 dimensions of a plane, right? Left, right, front, back, the 4 dimensions of a plane. That is the limited world, has no depth. Okay, north, south, east and west is a flat plane. The 5th is where it starts to expand. In fact, very interesting, in Hebrew, the letter that spells 4 is Daled. Daled is 2 lines at right angles. The classic stylized way of showing a flat surface, right? 2 dimensions, left, right, and up and front, back. That's a Daled. And in Hebrew, the word Daled means poverty. It means having nothing. Dal in Hebrew is poverty-stricken. Dalut, right? Dal means to subtract. It means not having. Right? That's the 4. 5, Chamisha, is already where you have an expansion. Interestingly, in Hebrew, a Hey, which is 5, is a Daled with a dot. Maharal says that's the 3rd dimension seen end on. In other words, it's the 2 dimensions of the flat surface, and then the 3rd. It's left, right, front, back, and up, down as well. You expand it into a volume. That sense of expansion is where joy begins. And you'll know that if you're ever going through a real life joy, your consciousness expands. When you're depressed, your consciousness shrinks. When people are really enjoying themselves, really happy, at a real significant life moment, the birth of a child or a wedding, their ambit, their personal space expands. You take other people in, you embrace, and you include others. Your consciousness expands. And depression is a shrinking of consciousness. In fact, when a person's in mourning, and you have a mitzvah to comfort them, how do you fulfill the mitzvah of comforting a mourner? You simply sit in front of them. You're not supposed to speak. You're not supposed to speak to them. You're certainly not supposed to speak to them to distract them. The consciousness needs to be on what they're going through and thinking about the person that they've lost. So what's the mitzvah? Simply to sit in front of them, to draw them out, to give them the opportunity to move towards you and speak to you. As you draw them out, you expand their consciousness. That will change their mood. Right? So that is the, by the way, when we're talking about 5, just as a side point, 6, which is about a move beyond 5. In Hebrew, shesh, which is 6, is exactly the same word as sas, which is sason, which is a higher form of joy. And of course, when you get to 7, in Hebrew, shiv'ah is the same word as sevi'ah, which means completely full. Now you've expanded into total fullness. And while we're on the subject, let's point out that 8 in Hebrew, shmone, shaman means fat, means beyond the borders of the necessary, right? Shamanta, you've expanded. Shemen is oil which floats to the top, and therefore 8 is always transcendental. 9 in Hebrew, tesha, sha in Hebrew means to turn towards. 9 is a preparation for 10, and 10 is eser, which is ashir, which is riches, not just more than enough, but enough to give others as well. That's the progression, but that's another subject. So simcha is the expansion of consciousness, which happens when you're moving from one situation to another. As you're moving from a limited situation to an expanded situation, you're moving from the zone of work to the zone of achievement. Every step of that journey that brings you closer to the destination. Every brick you put into that construction, right? You feel the expanded consciousness as you move towards Tachlis, and you feel the expansion of your own being as you build that project that is part of you, that's an expression of you. That's joy. Your hands may be bleeding, and your face may be pouring with sweat. There may be tears of exertion in your eyes, but you feel the ecstasy of the project taking shape. This can be truly addictive. And again, it's hard, the words are clumsy, but if you've ever built anything, you will realize that that is the case. People are asking me about Yom Tov and about Shabbos. We'll get there. Slowly, let's build this one step at a time. Let's build this one step at a time. Let's take the next step. When you think about your movement towards destination and how you enjoy it, as you work on a project and you climb that mountain, and it's delicious, conquering the challenge is delicious, analyze it carefully, you'll realize that the real source of the joy is the anticipation of destination. It's not the work that you're enjoying, it's the fact that the work is building the destination which you're longing to be at. And we can prove this very easily. If you're moving along that arduous journey to that longed-for destination, and the project is delicious, and you suddenly realize you're on the wrong road, your project will be destroyed before it's completed. The pain is no longer enjoyable, it's pure torture. The reason you enjoy the effort, the strain of moving towards destination, is because the release and ecstasy of the destination informs every step. In fact, if you know anything about life, you will know that very often the anticipation is better than the destination. Sometimes in life it pays not to arrive. It'll just be a disappointment. There's a reason for that, of course. The reason is that the anticipation is always perfect. You can anticipate perfection. You can never experience perfection. And therefore, that's the reason. That's the reason you enjoy a journey. Now let's ask the next question. How do you enjoy the destination? When you finally step off into the arms of the destination that you've been longing to reach, you finally reach that peak of the mountain. You finally hold in your hands that aesthetic thing that you built. You know where the pleasure comes from? How hard the work was that got you there. When you stand on that mountaintop, it's not the view that's giving you the pleasure. If they put you there by helicopter, you wouldn't feel the same thing. It's what you conquered to get there. When you hold that expression of aesthetic beauty in your hand that you worked on for an hour or a week or a month, it's not the beauty of the thing that speaks to you, it's how much of yourself you invested in it. Now this is very strange. This means that when you're moving towards destination, the pleasure of the journey is anticipating the destination. And when you get to the destination, the pleasure of the destination is how hard the journey was that got you there. This is a very interesting, endless loop. What does it mean? I'll tell you the secret. Everything that we experience in the world is projected from a higher world. Everything we experience in the world of the spirit, everything we experience, every manifestation in the world, every object, every event, every moment of time is projected from a transcendental world. That's called the kochot nivdalim. And everything you relate to here is to teach you about that. Not everything. Could be trivial things in your emotions, teach you about something deep. Everything in the deeper world is projected into this world. Everything in this world can be taken back there. The point of living in the world is to perceive a higher world. You're not in this world to perceive a body. You're in this world to perceive the soul within the body. Can you see it directly? No. But with a little sophisticated education, a little practice, right? a little learning to peel away the layers, when you see a human body, you learn. If you can divest yourself of lust and ego, you can divest yourself of those things, you can see the person inside. If you look at a human body and see a body, you're missing the point. The inner being that cannot be seen is more important. The point of looking at a body of a human being is to see the soul inside. Otherwise you are missing the point. You go to a concert and you watch the movements of the musicians and what they're wearing and the movement of the baton. You're missing the point. Unless you hear the music, right, you are grossly missing the point. Everything in this world is there to teach you about a higher world. Everything. So let's ask this. When you move towards a destination and enjoy the project, you enjoy the work, and when you get there, you enjoy knowing how hard it was to get there. What is that reflecting in the higher world? And the answer is life. What's our vision of life? What is the Torah vision of life? It's a journey, an arduous journey against resistance to a destination which is nothing other than what the work has resulted, what the work has built. Right? What's our concept of the world to come? What is our concept of the world to come? Yeah, I'm having some... Let's see if we can get this camera to cooperate. Alright, I'm sure that's good enough. What is our vision of the world to come? Our concept of Olam Haba is simply the work that you put in here. What's the concept of the world to come? Someplace you go where you have fun, where they give you good stuff to eat and things to do? The Jewish concept of the world to come is simply the sum total of the effort that you've put in here. How does the Zohar express the concept of the world to come? The Zohar says that, the Zohar puts it in 4 words. Tam ha'etz k'tam ha'pri. The taste of the tree is the taste of the fruit. In the next world, the taste of the tree is the taste of the fruit. What does that mean? In this world, a tree is a long, woody process that eventually brings out a delicious fruit. But in that world, you can walk up to the tree and eat the tree or the fruit. As then you realize the fruit is the tree. Not another place you go. It's a reliving of what you constructed here, stripped of all facade and illusion and raw material. Which means our vision of life is a working against resistance to a result, to achieve a result which is what you have constructed, right? With a satisfaction and the knowledge of what you yourself have built, have constructed. And therefore, every time you work for an hour on some project that you enjoy, and you become addicted to the work, and you enjoy the effort that you're making, and finally, as you anticipate the construction and the final result, and finally you get to the result and you enjoy how much of yourself was invested in this, you're experiencing a little bit of life itself. And there's no joy greater than experiencing life itself. Just being alive. If you're about to die and you survive, there's a moment of ecstasy at the realization of being alive. Of course, it doesn't last. You get bored, and you think that God owes it to you. But as long as you're moving, as long as you experience life richly, even for a moment, this is the secret, by the way, of people do things that lead them close to death. They jump off cliffs with a rubber rope attached to their ankle. Because when you realize you're alive, or they're prepared to put a gun to their head with one bullet in the chamber to see when they click if they are going to be alive. It's worth the chance of dying. Right? To feel people of spiritual greatness don't do things like that. A person of genuine spiritual awareness feels the joy of being alive at all times. You don't need to be about to die to feel it. So here's the secret. Real joy is the experience of expanded consciousness as you move towards a greater state, a bigger state, a more mature state. That's what it is. And that's what a festival is. A festival is a way station in Jewish history. When you come to a Pesach, what are you doing? You're experiencing, reliving the moment when the Jewish people were given freedom and became who we are. What a moment of ecstasy. And then you move on. You get out of the station, back on the train, and you move to a Shavuot where you receive the Torah. What an indescribable ecstasy. And then you listen carefully to this. Shabbat is destination. A festival is a station. The reason that Shabbat does not have the mitzvah of joy is because it's destination. It's where you sit down and rest. It's the ecstasy, that sort of joy, the oneg, the delicious ecstasy of having arrived at the destination. But a festival is the joy of the work in progression. And therefore, Shabbat is all about stopping work and all about sitting down. The word Shabbat means to sit in one place. You've arrived. No journey to be undertaken now. But a Chag, a festival. Chag, by the way, the word Chag means part of a circle. Chug, and Chag in Hebrew means a circle. This is part of a cycle. In Judaism, it's a spiral. Each year around is higher and higher, revisiting the same point at a more mature level of understanding, at a more mature level of spiritual absorption. That's what it is. The word moed, by the way, Chag means a circle. Moed means something that moves towards Ya'ad. In Hebrew, Ya'ad means destination. The Hebrew word ad always means endpoint, olam va'ed. Right? An aid is somebody who points to a witness, points to an event, in essence, from where he is now. Right? Olam va'ed. Moed is destination. Hayelchu shnaim yachtav bilti im no'adu. Shall two people walk together unless they have made a endpoint, a agreed point of meeting, what you call a rendezvous? Right? That is where you're moving. And a moed is a movement towards Ya'ad. Every festival, Rabbi Isaac Bernstein used to say, Shabbat is a destination and a festival is a station. What do you do on a station? You rest, you get off, you stop the journey. It has a little bit of Shabbat in it, but it's for the purpose of absorbing the next step in the Jewish journey. That's the ecstasy of a festival. Shabbat is the ecstasy of rest, putting down the burden, unburdening the load, and feeling the relaxation and the fulfillment and the ecstasy of arriving. But a festival, not like Shabbat. The prohibitions are not the same. The idea of a festival is a temporary stop on the road, right? And that's what Rabbi Crescas is talking about. When you get to a Pesach, you get to Shavuot, you get to a Sukkot, and you stop what you're doing, and life stops for you to absorb that message, that element of the journey, right? You would like a Howard, when a Yom Tov falls on Shabbos, then you experience both together. Absolutely, absolutely, sure. They each has an element of the other. Totally, absolutely. Howard, let me tell you the deep answer to your question. Nathaniel, same question. Let me tell you the deep answer. I hope I can express it in the 2 minutes that we have left. Shabbat is also a chag. What you're doing on Shabbat is practicing, moving towards destination, and experiencing. Again, let me say it like this. What are you supposed to gain from Shabbat? Shabbat is not the world to come. It's not the world to come, it's this world, but it's ma'en olam haba. On Shabbos you're practicing what it will feel like. You're imagining destination. What do you do when you stop off at a station? What do you do as you're moving on that project? You imagine. You stop off and imagine, visualize the end point, and then you put your shoulder to the wheel and you move on. Right? The artist, you're painting, and then you step back and you visualize the perfection. The composer. Right? You hear the music. You're motivated by vision of destination. And in that way you move towards destination. On Shabbat, you sit down and visualize destination. On a festival you don't do that. On Pesach you sit down and visualize, you re-experience. It's an anniversary of that marriage. Anniversary of the receiving of the status of being the Jewish people. Shavuot, anniversary of receiving the Torah. That's what anniversaries are. They should be ecstatic events. I know for some people they occasions of commiseration. But an anniversary should be looking back to that moment of ecstasy where the journey began, or a step on the journey was experienced. And each anniversary is another year of building that relationship and moving towards Tachlis. That's what a festival is. That's a Chag. That's a Moed moving towards Yad. And that's the Simchat Yom Tov. That's the festival. That's the joy of a festival. What do you think the joy of a festival is? Just eating and drinking? Eating and drinking is a celebration of this step on the Jewish journey. We are marching. Do you understand what this is? The Jewish people marching on a cosmic march. Been going for over 4,000 years. That is bringing the world to its final Tachlis. This is what the universe was constructed for. The Jewish people on historic march. Through cultures, through deserts, through good times, through holocausts, through tortures. Struggling along, sometimes marching with our heads held high, and sometimes stumbling along, being shot at and beaten, sometimes by our own people, through the deserts of history, carrying that Torah with us towards a final Tachlis that will bring the universe to its completion and to its fulfillment. Something larger than the mind can grasp. And every festival, every Yom Tov, you sit down and you think about that element, that instrument in the orchestra, that theme in the symphony that you're listening to at that point in time, making, experiencing. And then you move on. Shabbos, you sit down and imagine a messianic era. On Shabbos, you practice what it will feel like to move into a destination where you can no longer move. Shabbat, you stop all construction. That's why desecration of Shabbos is so disastrous spiritually. Because you're destroying the movement, the concept of endpoint in life. That's what Shabbos is. Shabbos isn't just a nice opportunity to enjoy your family and sleep a bit extra. Shabbos is a premonition of a world to come. And in that premonition, Howard, you build it. That's the festival element in Shabbos. I hope this is clear. Okay, we didn't have time to talk about depression, but the message should be obvious. Depression is the result of a life going nowhere. A life devoid of Torah and mitzvahs. If you're Jewish, your soul will always be longing for that. If you're human and not Jewish, you need to feel that you're building the world. When the wheels are spinning and time is going by and nothing's being built, you will get depressed. If you're Jewish, you need that extra. The Jewish neshama is longing for that fulfillment of Tachlis, that building and construction of the world, through the unique element, that is the Jewish element, which is Torah and mitzvahs. Right? Without that, there's always something lacking in the Jewish soul. And Jews look for it every place else. They look for it in other religions and exotic spiritual paths. Never satisfy. Satisfy for a time, but never satisfy ultimately. And that is because to be well-adjusted means knowing who you are. If you're a male and you're well-adjusted, you use maleness. If you're a female and you're well-adjusted, you use femaleness. I'm not talking about chemical and surgical problems. I'm talking about, if you're Jewish, you use Judaism. Right? Otherwise you're denying your essence. That's being well adjusted, is feeling the ecstasy of using the gifts and the uniqueness of your unique personal situation. And that is the recipe for joy. And people feeling that you can be a prophet, prophesying the destruction, and yet you're receiving a prophecy, ecstatic in knowing that he's doing what he has to be doing. Right? Jonah decides to take a nap when the ship is breaking up and they're panicking because it's a storm. He's cool. He's a baby in his mother's arms, moving towards, she can be walking to a gas chamber, it makes no difference to him. Right? The great, people great enough spiritually, in the storm, the eye of the storm, in the act of mourning for someone who's died, is the joy of knowing I'm doing what I have to be doing right now. I'll leave you with this. My brother-in-law, who's the doctor of Rav Simcha Wasserman, one of the great teachers of the last generation, we were so close to him. He lived a life of unmitigated tragedy. It's so long, there's no time to go into the details now. Again, childless, saw his family wiped out. His father was shot by the Germans, the great Rabbi Wasserman, his wife's family was wiped out. A life of unedited tragedy. And he glowed with joy. He sparkled with joy. When I wrote a book about him, I wanted to put a picture of him on the cover. And Art Scroll, who published the book, they refused because he wasn't smiling in that picture. They said, it's not right to do a book about him and not show his joy. And so they put a picture of him smiling on the cover. He scintillated with joy. So once, and I'll finish with this, my brother-in-law was very close to him, and he was his doctor, once gathered the courage to ask him a personal question. He said, how does the rabbi manage to be in such joy always? Let's face it, you've lived through a life of such torment and such tragedy. How do you manage to sparkle with joy always? Listen to what the rabbi said. He said, every situation I find myself in, I ask what can be done. Whatever can be done, I do. Whatever cannot be done, I do not worry about. What we do is, we don't do what should be done, and we worry. But a person of spiritual greatness does what needs to be done, and the rest is his problem. Do you feel it? Sure, you have the weight of responsibility and tragedy on your shoulders, but it's not my problem. He knows what he's doing. You can be a soldier on the battlefield while everyone's being shot to pieces. Are you worrying about the war, or are you worrying about, if you're a medic and your job is to take one more soldier and stop the bleeding, are you doing the job? Do your job. Do what can be done. He knows what he's doing. Do you feel it? Yes, you feel it. But it's not your... Anyway, the point is that happiness is knowing what you need to be doing, right? Well-adjusted means knowing what it is you have to be doing. Happiness is doing what it is you have to be doing. When you move along your road to your destination, you will be happy. And that is a choice of attitude. And that you can choose. Thank you for joining me. I hope to see you next week in a slightly different format. You'll have to watch the website to see exactly what is the JLE has decided that Monday night has come to an end as well, Darren. Yes, they're substituting a Sunday night program. Look at the website, please, to see the new decisions. As they say, I work here, so I trust that their decisions are wise. They know what people need. We'll start the new format next week. Meantime, until then, have a wonderful week. Thanks for joining me. All the best.